In the next few days, Kay found it impossible to exchange even a word with Fraulein Burstner. He tried to get hold of her by every means he could think of, but she always managed to elude him. He went straight home from his office and sat on the sofa in his room, with the light out and the door open, concentrating his attention on the entrance hall. If the maid on her way past shut the door of his apparently empty room, he would get up after a while and open it again. He rose every morning an hour earlier than usual on the chance of catching Fraulein Burstner alone before she went to her work. But none of these stratagems succeeded. Then he wrote a letter to her, sending it both to her office and to her house address, in which he once more tried to justify his behavior, offered to make any reparation required, promised never to overstep the bounds that she should prescribe for him, and begged for her to give him an opportunity of merely speaking to her, more especially as he could arrange nothing with Frau Grubeck until he had first consulted with her, concluding with the information that next Sunday he would wait in his room all day for some sign that she was prepared either to grant his request or at least to explain why, even though he was pledging his word to defer to her in everything, she would not grant it. His letters were not returned, but neither were they answered. On Sunday, however, he was given a sign whose meaning was sufficiently clear. In the early morning, Kay observed through the keyhole of his door an unusual commotion in the entrance hall, which soon explained itself. A teacher of French, she was a German girl called Montag, a sickly, pale girl with a slight limp, who till now had occupied a room of her own, was apparently moving into Fraulein Burstner's room. For hours she kept on trailing through the entrance hall. She seemed to be always forgetting some article of underwear, or a scrap of drapery, or a book that necessitated a special journey to carry it into the new apartment. When Frau Grubeck brought in his breakfast, ever since she had angered Kay, she had devoted herself to performing even the most trifling services for him. Kay could not help breaking the silence between them for the first time. Why is there such a row in the entrance hall today? He asked, as he poured out his coffee. Couldn't it be put off to some other time? Must the place be spring cleaned on a Sunday? Although Kay did not glance up at Frau Grubeck, he could observe that she heaved a sigh of relief. These questions, though stern, she construed as forgiveness, or as an approach toward forgiveness. The place is not being spring cleaned, Herr Kay, she said. Fraulein Montag is moving in with Fraulein Burstner and shifting her things across. She said no more, waiting first to see how Kay would take it, and if he would allow her to go on. But Kay kept her on the rack reflectively, stirring his coffer and remaining silent. Then he looked up at her and said, Have you given up your previous suspicions of Fraulein Burstner? Herr Kay cried, I should give you notice. Give you notice! The last ejaculation was already stifled in her sobs. She raised her apron to her face and wept aloud. Please don't cry, Frau Grubach, said Kay, looking out through the window. He was really thinking of Fraulein Burstner and of the fact that she had taken a strange girl into her room. Please don't cry, he said again as he turned back to the room and found Frau Grubach still weeping. I didn't mean what I said so terribly seriously either. We misunderstood each other. That can happen occasionally, even between old friends. Frau Grubach took her apron from her eyes to see whether Kay was really appeased. Come now, that's all there is to it, said Kay, and then ventured to add, since to judge from Frau Grubach's expression, her nephew, the captain, could not have divulged anything. Do you really believe that I would turn against you because of a strange girl? That's just it, Erke, said Frau Grubach. It was her misfortune that as soon as she felt relieved in her mind, she immediately said something tactless. I kept asking myself, why would Herr K. bother himself so much about Fraulein Burstner? Why should he quarrel with me because of her, though he knows that every cross word from him makes me lose my sleep? And I said nothing about the girl that I hadn't seen with my own eyes. Kay made no reply to this. He should have sent her from the room at the very first word, and he did not want to do that. He contented himself with drinking his coffee and leaving Frau Grubach to feel that her presence was burdensome. Outside, he could hear again the trailing step of Fraulein Montag as she limped from end to end of the entrance hall. Do you hear that? Asked Kay, indicating the door. Yes, said Frau Grubach, sighing. I offered to help her, and to order the maid to help too, but she's self-willed. She insists on moving everything herself. I'm surprised at Fraulein Burstner. I often regret having Fraulein Montag as a boarder, but now Fraulein Burstner is actually taking her into her own room. You mustn't worry about that, said Kay, crushing with the spoon the sugar left at the bottom of his cup. Does it mean any loss to you? No, said Frau Grubach. In itself, it's quite welcome to me. I am left with an extra room, and I can put my nephew, the captain, there. I've been bothered in case he might have disturbed you these last few days, for I had to let him occupy the living room next door. He's not very considerate. What an ordeal, said Kay, getting up. There's no question of that. You really seem to think I'm hypersensitive because I can't stand Fraulein Montag's trailings to and fro. There she goes again, coming back this time. Frau Grubach felt quite helpless. Shall I tell her, Erke, to put off the moving of her things until later? If you like, I'll do it at once. But she's got to move into Fraulein Burstner's room, cried Kay. Yes, said Frau Grubach. She could not quite make out what Kay meant. Well then, said Kay, she might surely be allowed to shift her things just reached the door again when there was a knock. It was the maid, who announced that Fraulein Montag would like a word or two with Eric, and that she accordingly begged him to come to the dining room, where she was waiting for him. Kay listened pensively to the message. Then he turned an almost mocking eye on the startled Frau Grubeck. His look seemed to say that he had long foreseen this invitation of Fraulein Montag's, and that it accorded very well with all the persecution he had had to endure that Sunday morning from Frau Grubeck's boarders. He sent the maid back with the information that he would come at once, then went to his wardrobe to change his coat, and in answer to Frau Grubeck, who was softly lamenting over the behavior of the importunate Fraulein Montag, had nothing to say but to request her to remove his breakfast tray. "Why, you've scarcely touched anything," said Frau Grubeck. "Oh, do take it away," cried Kay. It seemed to him as if Fraulein Montag were somehow mixed up with the food and made it nauseating. As he crossed the entrance hall, he glanced at the closed door of Fraulein Burstner's room. Still he had not been invited there, but to the dining room, where he flung open the door without knocking. It was a very long, narrow room, with one large window. There was only enough space in it to wedge two cupboards at an angle on either side of the door. The rest of the room was completely taken up by the long dining table, which began near the door and reached to the very window, making it almost inaccessible. The table was already laid, and for many people too, since on Sunday almost all the boarders had their midday dinner in the house. When Kay entered, Fraulein Montag advanced from the window along one side of the table to meet him. They greeted each other in silence. Then Fraulein Montag said, holding her head very erect as usual, "I don't know if you know who I am." Kay stared at her with contracted brows. "Of course I do," he said. "You've been staying quite a long time with Frau Grubeck, haven't you? But you don't take much interest in the boarders, I fancy," said Fraulein Montag. "No," said Kay. "Won't you take a seat?" asked Fraulein Montag. In silence, they pulled out two chairs at the very end of the table and sat down opposite each other. But Fraulein Montag immediately stood up again, for she had left her little handbag lying on the window-sill and now went to fetch it. She trailed it along the whole length of the room. As she came back, swinging the bag lightly in her hand, she said, "I've been asked by my friend to say something to you, that's all. She wanted to come herself, but she is feeling a little unwell today. She asked you to excuse her and listen to me instead. She would not have said anything more to you in any case than I am going to say. On the contrary, I fancy that I can actually tell you more, as I am relatively impartial. Don't you think so, too?" "Well, what is there to say?" replied Kay, who was weary of seeing Fraulein Montag staring so fixedly at his lips. Her stare was already trying to dominate any words he might utter. "Fraulein Burstner evidently refuses to grant me the personal interview I asked for." "That is so," said Fraulein Montag, "or rather, that isn't it at all. You put it much too harshly. Surely in general interviews are neither must assume, knows what this conversation would be about, and is therefore convinced, for reasons of which I am ignorant, that it would be to nobody's benefit if it actually took place. To tell the truth, she did not mention the matter to me until yesterday, and only in passing she said, among other things, that you could not attach very much importance to this interview either, for it could only have been by accident that you hit on the idea, and that even without a specific explanation you could soon come to see how silly the whole affair was, if indeed you didn't see that already. I told her that that might be quite true, but that I considered it advisable, if the matter were to be completely cleared up, that you should receive an explicit answer. I offered myself as an intermediary, and after some hesitation my friend yielded to my persuasions, but I hope that I have served your interest too, for the slightest uncertainty, even in the most trifling matter, is always a worry, and when, as in this case, it can be easily dispelled, it is better that that should be done at once. Thank you, said Kay, and he slowly rose to his feet, glanced at Fraulein Montag, then at the table, then out through the window. The sun was shining on the house opposite, and walked to the door. Fraulein Montag followed him for a few steps, as if she did not quite trust him, but at the door they had both to draw back, for it opened and Captain Lanz entered. This was the first time that Kay had seen him close at hand. He was a tall man in the early 40s, with a tanned, fleshy face. He made a slight bow, which included Kay as well as Fraulein Montag, then went up to her and respectfully kissed her hand. His movements were easy. His politeness toward Fraulein Montag was in striking contrast to the treatment which she had received from Kay. All the same, Fraulein Montag did not seem to be offended with Kay, for she actually purposed, Kay fancied, to introduce him to the captain. But Kay did not wish to be introduced. He was not in the mind to be polite either to the captain or to Fraulein Montag. The hand-kissing had, in his eyes, turned the pair of them into accomplices who, under a cloak of the utmost amiability and altruism, were seeking to bar his way to Fraulein Burstner. Yet he fancied that he could see even more than that. He recognized that Fraulein Montag had chosen a very good, if somewhat two-edged weapon. She had exaggerated the importance of the connection between Fraulein Burstner and Kay. She had exaggerated above all the importance of the interview he had asked for, and she had tried at the same time so to manipulate things as to make it appear that it was Kay who was exaggerating. She would find that she was deceived. Kay wished to exaggerate nothing. He knew that Fraulein Burstner was an ordinary little typist who could not resist him for long. In coming to this conclusion, he deliberately left out of account what Frau Grubeck had told him about Fraulein Burstner. He was thinking all this as he quitted the room with a curt word of leave-taking. He made straight for his own room, but a slight titter from Fraulein Montag, coming from the dining room behind him, put it into his head that perhaps he could provide a surprise for the pair of them, the captain as well as cautiously opened the door, not without a feeling that he was doing something wrong, and even more useless than wrong. There was nothing in the room. Moreover, it had scarcely any resemblance now to the room which he had seen. Against the wall, 2 beds stood next to each other. 3 chairs near the door were heaped with dresses and underclothes. A wardrobe was standing open. Fraulein Burstner had apparently gone out while Fraulein Montag was saying her piece in the dining room. Kay was not very much taken back. He had hardly expected at this stage to get hold of Fraulein Burstner so easily. He had made this attempt, indeed, mainly to annoy Fraulein Montag. Yet the shock was all the greater when, as he was shutting the door again, he saw Fraulein Montag and the captain standing talking together in the open door of the dining room. They had perhaps been standing there all the time. They scrupulously avoided all appearance of having been observing him.